everyone, and welcome to another episode of Respecting the Beer. My name is Gary Arndt, and with me, as always, is Bobby Fleshman and Allison McCoy. And so far in the podcast, we've talked about the science of beer. We've talked about the history of beer, talked a little bit about the culture of beer. And so today, and for the next few episodes, we want to talk a little bit about the business and the economics of beer. Because I think a lot of people either don't even think about this when they have a beer, or maybe they're a home brewer and they've thought about maybe expanding what they're doing, and they're really not sure what goes into it. So let's go back, and we've touched upon this a little bit earlier. You guys decide you're going to open a brewery. What goes into that? I mean, once you've made that decision, like, there are a lot of upfront costs that go into creating a brewery. And I've been around, like, your brewing room. There's a lot of stuff.
Shiny stuff is expensive, yes.
So how does that start, and what goes into it? What are the costs that you, before you even brew the first batch of beer, that you have to start considering?
Well, Allison looks like,
we're just looking at each other like, okay, that kind of the moment that you're like, I don't know, let's say you're on a cliff and you're like, we're going to bungee jump. This is cool. And your friend's right there with you, and kind of give that eye to each other. And you're like, are we really going to do this? That was the look Bobby and I just gave each other.
You have to let go of the wing.
Oh, God.
I think that Will Smith gave a speech at a college once. Climb out on the wing and then let go.
Just let go.
Yeah.
But I think that it's not necessarily, it's going to sound strange, but it's not a decision that we made and like at just one moment. It involved getting our families together, getting enough financing together, getting the bank to agree that they thought we knew what we were doing enough, writing that we knew what we were doing, learning what we didn't know, which we still don't know a lot. And so it was almost like there were these little bitty small steps. It wasn't climbing Everest in just one jump, or I guess in one climb. It was getting to continual base camps along the way.
One thing we should say right off is that making beer is not owning a brewery.
Oh, God.
Those are not commutable
and that's
or relatable.
where we were so naive. Oh, my God. How much we didn't
there had to
know.
have been a point, though, where you signed a loan, or there was something where there was a point of no return, right? Well, this was like, we've now jumped.
I would say the big loan, but it actually didn't work out that way. We purchased the building first. And then so we own the building, which is a huge win for any small business because rent can't just all of a sudden go up.
Yeah, and if you do really well in business, your landlord often decides to triple your rent. And I've seen that happen.
Yeah, and some breweries have suffered from that. But for us, we bought the building first. So then now we just have real estate that we could get out of. Then we got what was called a construction loan, to where we didn't actually, we only drew from it as we built. And so we were continuously like basically putting that money into investing into a property. And so when the business finally started, I think that's, Gary, to your question of like, when was the actual point of no return? I think it's when we formed the LLC and linked it to a loan. I think that's when we were like, oh, okay, now we got to pay this loan back.
I think
beyond the collateral of the building.
I don't want to say point of no return, but I think one of the most important moments in the history of the company is when I decided to go to brewing school and move away from home it was 2012 at that point where we were doing that. And that set in motion the dominoes that would become the brewery.
Yeah, that's
it wasn't
wrong,
a monetary.
Though. It's you. I mean, you could go and then consult for a brewery. You consulted for Stone Arch Brewing Company just down the street for a while. And so I don't think that that's necessarily the.
But it's sweat equity. Right.
Yeah.
It's
right.
time that you put in.
Yeah,
it's an investment that most home brewers are never going to do that.
Right.
That's a step beyond what they were, whatever they do.
And I sort of left, and I did leave another career in the process. So for me personally, whether it was to open a brewery or just be part of the industry, it was definitely a fork in the road.
Mm-hmm.
But then you get a building. Mm-hmm. And I understand you could have rented this building out if things didn't go up or sold it or whatever. But then you got to buy the shiny stuff in the back.
Yeah, shiny stuff in the back. That's expensive.
What did you have to buy? Did you make a list of like, oh, we need this, and we need this, we need this? And what was that list based on? Because you'd never done anything at this scale.
Right. I spent a long time writing a business plan, and it's several hundred pages. There's several hundred pages that are not in it. it was so long that the banks, when I handed it to them, just basically gave us a loan. They said no one puts this much into it without having done their
It
research.
did help that, and it frustrates me to no end that you have a PhD credential that they just like, oh, PhD, okay, we'll give you money, which is crap because PhD in astrophysics has nothing to do with PhD in business.
Exactly, yeah.
So
yeah.
I'm
But it
so
does mean
frustrated by that.
perseverance. It does mean that I'm able to persevere.
That's true.
It does mean that I'm able to problem solve, and I think that's what those three letters should
And
translate.
also, I think, at least for it shows that you don't know things and know how to find those things. So you can teach yourself.
You learn that you don't know, and then you figure out how to teach yourself. But to Gary's point, what was the list of things? And so it would be comical to look at what we thought was going to be that list versus what we actually ended up, no matter how much work I did on that business plan, to compare the reality and the expectation.
But in the year it took you to write that business plan, I just want to paint a picture for everyone. Bobby's probably the most work ethic centric person I've ever met, or in the world, maybe. There you go. I'll raise that challenge. As in, like, 5 a.m., he gets up, he goes for his run. 6 a.m., he's got his coffee, and he's starting to work on his business plan. And this is before we had a kid. And so he would continue to work on that business plan. I mean, there are like divots in the rugs of where he never moved the chair because he worked from about 6 a.m. to about 8 p.m. or so while I was building.
Studying for an exam around that time too.
And every day, like clockwork. And I'd go out with friends, go to the pub, have some beers and enjoy. And he's like, nope, I got to go back and work on the business plan. It was every day for all the years.
This is fascinating for me because I've had several successful businesses in my life. I never had a plan for one of them.
Right.
I've never raised money for one of them.
Yeah.
I bootstrapped I funded it through poverty. It's how I basically did all of them. But I also had no family, no kids or anything.
Yeah.
But it was a completely different approach from that. And of course, all my businesses had no capital equipment.
Right.
Yeah. The shiny stuff. Oh my God. It's so expensive.
It's hard to bootstrap that. You see a lot of breweries try to, and the ones that succeed are few and far between. I mean, succeed on the level that they can be profitable. There are very few that can do that.
Well, and not only that, the creativity of we are in a small building for a manufacturing facility and a, whatever this is called, hospitality space.
Yeah.
And so it's a ship in a bottle. And to be creative in how do we maximize capacity. And it's something that's bitten us in the rear end a little bit.
We were just talking this morning about the mistakes we made and how we do it differently.
And I think this building is too small for the growth that we probably need to see, which then opens up, well, does that mean that you're going to either move locations or go bigger, which we would never leave this location.
But that always point to the positives of being here. So it's never black and white. Now, to Gary's point about not writing a business plan before opening a business, you don't have to open. In fact, a business plan is just an exercise. It's not connect the dots. So we've gone through an exercise, a virtual exercise.
When people ask me about traveling, I always say your ability to adapt is more important than your ability to plan.
Right.
Because your plans are going to go haywire day one.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And then you just need to figure out how you can adapt from there. And I assume it was the same way. This was like a guide.
Yeah.
Right. I did not in year 3 put, year 2 was it, that we would have a pandemic. I didn't. How in the world does anyone make plans for that? So we had a plan, and in some ways, we sort of matched what we expected, but in other ways, we're a distributing brewery now because of the pandemic. And so that's wildly different.
Going back to the plan, how much beer did you assume in the plan that you were going to make year 1?
If I recall, I'm digging back into that fictitious prediction.
Don't look at me. I never read
I
it.
feel like it was.
I'm kidding.
I feel like it was a couple of hundred barrels. And
That's all.
Yeah, in year 1, and that was going to be double that the next year and then double again the next year. And that actually was kind of tracking right until the pandemic hit. So maybe it was more than just an exercise. Maybe we were pretty close. There were some things that changed. We thought we'd have more to-go sales by way of growlers, these glass jars people bring into breweries. That didn't happen. People stopped doing that. But otherwise, it was pretty close. We expected to be having to be building onto the building between years 3 and 5 to deal with the capacity that we would need.
Well, and we have expanded because we rent a large part of, there's a warehouse behind us that's owned by another individual that we rent a large part of, where we have a very large cooler that we store all the beer.
And it's worth mentioning Appleton Beer Factory next door to us. They're our spiritual partners in all this, and they rent us space, loan us space to do a lot of stuff we could never do if we had to rely on our own footprint. Now, the expansion to the brewery would be where our stage now sits and where our beer garden has grown. And so we don't think that's touchable. We don't want to really mess with that. We wanted to evolve that and more beautify that space as it is. But I think our next move, we got a few options on the table, but we can't stay here forever. Even if we could squeak out a lot more beer, let's say 20% more beer, it's going to tax people. I don't want to tax people. I want things to get a little bit more breathable in terms of space and efficiencies.
Well, but I think that this facility, for lack of a better phrase, will always be our pilot system.
Yeah, exactly. And I do have some ideas on the table, but the market's really volatile right now in beer. We should say that. And the time capsule that this podcast is that right now, with all the competition in RTDs, which are ready to drink, flavored malt beverages, and you have seltzers and ciders and on, it goes on and on and on, non-alcoholics. There's so many different things happening in that sphere that used to not be, that beer is taking the brunt of it. And actually so is wine at this point. And spirits are also getting a little bit nervous too, because there's so many alternatives. But that's just a side note, but it kind of speaks to the volatility of owning a business.
I want to go back to the plan again and the shiny stuff. When you purchased the fermenters and everything, well, for starters, how much of what you have today was bought initially versus, added subsequently after you started?
I would say, as far as the shiny stuff, I would say we probably bought about 60% of it, and now about 40% of what we have we bought since we opened.
We should add it was not shiny at all when we bought it. Oh,
that is exactly the opposite of what it was.
Was it used?
It was used. Yes, we bought it. It was a family in Seoul, Korea, wanted to rebuild Castle Prague from Prague in Czech Republic.
People don't know it has a sort of it's a clock tower, and I think there's some astronomical symbols.
That's not Prague Tower, but I know what you're referring to. The astronomical clock is in kind of the town square.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So anyway, they basically built this Czech Republic brewing system for this place in Korea, and then the Korean family said, "Okay, we're done with this."
They love Czech beer. So
they did, and they brewed it and everything, and then they decommissioned it, and then it went on the market, and so we got it from a broker out of, I believe it was Seattle.
Yeah, he lives in hop country. Yeah.
And so then we had it shipped to us, but it was built in Europe, but installed in Korea, and then now we had to get it to match a U.S. electric.
Oh, okay. There's
I can't even say
whole
how hard it
podcast
was.
on that, but there's 4 continents in the story. It had a sister system
that's right.
that ended up in South Africa.
Yeah.
And we're going to do a hemispherical collaboration.
It was
with
funny
those
because when
guys
we were
someday.
installing the system, we were not texting, but emailing back and forth, and it was like 24-hour delay every time. We had a question on how to install it. But the system was completely corroded. It was like, okay, no, but we got it.
It's not corroded. So
not corroded,
it's
sorry.
a copper-clad brewing system, and copper oxidizes.
There you go, oxidized.
And this is the beauty of copper. Once it has oxidized, it doesn't further oxidize. It's a protective layer. So they decided it wasn't worth the fight of keeping the copper clean. So they let it oxidize, and that was a good thing in the end. It protected the copper.
It did protect it. Now it's all shiny.
But then we spent the time to clean it.
There were 4 large fermenters with it, or 5.
5, yeah.
And then since then, we actually used, how did this work? During COVID, we could get money to put into the company for both payroll to keep our employees employed, but also to put money into the business to adapt to this new environment. And so we qualified for some money to then buy another fermenter because we had to increase our production for distribution.
Because the margins are smaller. We had to increase our volume.
I never even thought to ask this. I mean, we've talked about how the pandemic hurt, obviously, people coming to the pub.
Yeah.
Were you now eligible for these COVID loans?
We were.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we were eligible for those. And so we used them to help and then we justified it by,
we kicked ass in 2020. We actually grew over 19, which was our third year. 20.
Yeah, but then it bit us in the ass.
But then that bit us in the ass because we actually outperformed 19. And so we were, in a lot of ways, we were penalized and not given.
Yeah, so there was some loan, so there was some federal money that would go to a business if they didn't gross as much as they did.
Even if you were $1 less than the year prior, then it was all sort of it was a grant instead of
But we
a
grossed
loan.
more, but we didn't net more because we were
flip back
canning
to the
everything
definition of a loan.
by hand.
Yeah.
One at a time, 24/7. Oh my God.
So, but we did that, and it grew us into the company we are now, and we got the exposure we have now. But these are the things you don't think about that came out of COVID.
Let's talk about distributing beer versus selling it here in the pub. Kind of, I would assume, generally speaking, the two arms of the business. You run this facility, and then
right. We're even doing our accounting that way now. We're splitting those up. Yeah.
Where, just as a percentage, what percentage of the business involves the pub, and what percentage of the business now involves selling and distributing beer?
60% of the revenue is from the pub, but 60% of our volume's in distro. It might be more like 70-30, but the point is they're opposite because the margins are so low in wholesale. But they're necessary because they fund the operations of that side of the business. The rest of it's funding all the embellishments and all the front of house costs. Yeah, that's kind of a broad stroke.
Due to taxes and wholesale and just the multi-tier system of the distributor versus the consumer, or the place that sells, the retailer, to really support a brewery, buy the beer at the bar. That is the best way.
Hell yeah, that's the reason we do.
I would assume that your margins here are much better.
4 times.
So amazing.
And
but it's not so amazing as in like, we're making so much money. We're not.
No, it covers all of the all the
covers
overhead.
the costs and the employees. And Bobby and I were talking earlier about if you could sum up, like, if someone wants to go into the brewery business, what would you tell them? It's like, get ready to just barely make a living. You're not going to make a fortune because the margins are just so small.
It also sort of explains, panning out, why we're seeing a bubble burst in beer, apart from all the other things. You have COVID, and I mentioned these other products that are competing with beer. But a lot of people got into beer because it was hot. And like 20 years ago, it was really hot, ramping up into about a 10-year period where it was just 20% every year. People would take a lot of money, angel investors, and try to double and triple that. And they were doing it pretty well. But quickly, that bubble burst. That bubble burst a long time ago. So people have asked about, when's the bubble going to burst? Well, that one probably did 10 years ago. But out of that, you saw those people that were in it for the, quote, right reasons persevere and onward through a pandemic and everything else as rising costs go and all this stuff. So I think the bubble did burst. It was replaced by a different craft beer movement or a different decade just because of the turnaround going to not 100%, not even 10%. This is a long game now.
The fact that the pub has higher margins makes perfect sense. No one's getting a cut. It's all you guys. But this building is of a finite size. I've been here where it's been packed. Some nights of the week, not so much. And you've done some expansion. We're sitting in the second floor of this building right now, which was not open 6 months ago.
Gary should take credit for this idea. Gary helped us brainstorm how to make this happen.
But distribution, it seems like, well, you could double, triple, quadruple that, because it's kind of like almost infinite in terms of how much you could conceivably sell. So going forward, what is the plan? Is it to do more with the pub, a higher margin business, or to do more with distribution, which potentially lower margins, but more potential revenue?
Right. Great question. And that's the fork in the road we're at. And I would say that the piece you left out was how competitive wholesale is. It is extremely competitive out there. It's not just infinite. I mean, it is infinite, but the investment on marketing and branding, if you want to take it to the next level, is significant. So when I think about wholesale, I think we're probably going to grow it in tandem with the tap room. But right now, we're going to focus on this tap room. I told Allison I've been meeting with a consultant to help me figure out the answer to your question. And I think at this point in time, we're going to double down. We agreed 90 days. I'm going to double down on making this tap room even more popular than it is. Do as much as I can to polish this, our flagship.
She told you, don't think about another tap room expansion for 90 days, which was best advice you've ever been given.
Yes. So, and I was asking her.
By tap room expansion, like expanding this.
Tap room.
Oh, okay.
Well, yes, right.
Second
Let's dial this one in. And I keep saying this we have got to dial in our SOPs, our
Standard operating
procedures to the point that we can treat this as a franchise and replicate it. And it's good advice for anyone, even if you only intend to own the one spot. It just speaks to the health of the company and its ability to run on its own. So I want to continue to refine our operations here, but that's, like I said, in the next 90 days. And then after that, if we've been able to do it here, we'll think about what it looks like elsewhere.
Although there are cheaper options because we have contract brews. So we have the large Oktoberfest that goes downtown Appleton. So we've done the special craft beer for that, but we can't possibly make that much beer. So we contracted out some other breweries, and they took our recipe and they made the beer for us. So we've done that a few times. So we could expand that way.
I would say now we're up to almost 30% of our volume we're brewing elsewhere at this point. It just speaks to the capacity we have.
And there's a lot of companies that are just contract brewers. So there's a lot of beer that you might be consuming that actually wasn't brewed at the one place.
Top-notch technical brewers.
Oh, yeah.
Top-notch. And that, to be a contract brewer, you're not concerned with marketing and branding. You're a technical facility that's able to match scientifically those numbers.
Like fermenters for hire.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Exactly.
Let's talk about some of the taproom business, because I've seen, since I've started coming here, an evolution in the business. I would come in and you'd occasionally have beer from another brewery on tap. You do some swap. I don't see that much anymore.
And we just added 8 lines this year.
And I was going to say, the number of beers you're providing has increased, and they're all beers that you make.
Yeah, and not just beers. With ciders and NA products and hop water. It's on and on. Yeah.
So what goes into those decisions about, I suppose, the number of beers that you serve? Because you have a pretty extensive menu at this point.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what you choose, and this might be a good time to bring it up. We had a question from someone in the Facebook group. There's this decision you have to make between, are you making beers for public, general consumption that people want to buy? Because I've literally been sitting at the bar a few days ago. A woman comes up and says, "What do you have that's closest to a Bud Light?" And I know a little bit of you dies inside when you hear that.
Not
but
really.
It's also probably not an uncommon thing.
We even have that beer at this point where I'm thinking about brewing it again. We call it State Street Light Lager. So we make one for that person too. It's just not on tap right now because we only have 24 lines now.
So the hazy IPA, I think, is the big example, at least of late. Because for the longest time, we were like, we are never going to brew a hazy.
Why?
Well, that's a great question.
Yeah. What is the...
Well, from a technical standpoint, hazies are actually going against all of the work that you do to keep a beer clear.
All right. I'm on record on other podcasts saying that every style was new before it was traditional at some point.
That's fair.
And I feel like we may be at that place with hazies.
Hazies.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was a craze. It was all of a sudden hazies were everywhere. And I'm going to let Bobby continue to talk because I don't want to hurt our brand at all.
No, I love brewing every style, even if I don't drink them, because A, we're not going to put out a shitty product. It's going to be top shelf every time. But B, I mean, that's sort of an aside, but the primary thing is I love challenge, and I think we learn something from going down these other pathways.
Well, and actually, I'm not even going to ask, I'm just going to do it. So one of our most famous hazies that we make, the Blazy, it's a blood orange hazy.
Yeah.
That was
It was spelled blasé. There was some...
No. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Every time they try and name a
inside
beer.
jokes. Yeah.
And they're like, let's be cute. And I was like, no, if people can't pronounce it, they're not going to buy it.
If you put umlauts, they won't order it. We've learned.
But in the Blazy's Blood Orange Hazy, there was one hop addition you didn't like in the hazy that you were trying to do. And you were like, gosh, I'm not happy with this product. But if we sweeten it, maybe, what if we add blood orange? And Blazy was born. And you've since tweaked it.
Yeah, well, it was an accident turned into a success. Yeah. And that's something as an owner you have to do too. You can't just make these home brewer type decisions on $3,000, $5,000 worth of liquid. You have where you just dump and start over.
And that's
You've got
the
to figure out
cost
how to
of
roll
the
with those
dry good
punches.
ingredients that goes into the beer.
Yeah.
So each beer that we make,
and also
we have
tank
to,
time, right? Now we've tied up a tank for 10% of our tank year, if you would call it that. What are we going to do with that time? Send that down the drain too. So there are considerations you have to make, and you can't send a shitty product out either. So you got to figure out how to thread that needle. And that's where you get some innovation, I think, at the end of the day. About the primary question that was asked about deviating from brand and making hazies, I would say that if we lived in, and I say this a lot, if we lived in a big city where we could focus on one thing and be one thing, then we wouldn't make hazies. We wouldn't have to. And that would be like 12 beer engines, and we would have every flavor of cask ale you can find in the UK, for example. That would be one business model for us to pursue. But when you live in Appleton, you have to make everything.
Yeah.
Because you have to make sure you get enough people in the door to keep the lights on.
And there's been some beers, like one of my favorite beers is our oatmeal stout. It's called Square Mile. I absolutely love it. It's 3%. It's like rich and thin at the same time, and no one else drank it except me. And so I don't think we're going to brew it again. So that was pretty devastating.
I think we'll brew it again. Yeah, there's a low alcoholic movement now.
Well, yeah.
So,
I guess it was 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, we were a little bit ahead of the curve.
I'll be very honest. I've been drinking the Gosa.
Yeah,
Last several times I've been here because
Gosa.
it's like 3.4% alcohol.
It's another one in that.
It
in
is
that line.
a more acidic,
Yep.
tart type beer that I kind of like.
Yep.
And yeah, I've been kind of getting that all the time.
Exactly.
I
And-
agree.
And 547, we'll probably talk about that a little more later. It has a little sister now that we're calling Little Tornado. If anyone wants to know the reference, 547 is the address whose name is Tornado. It's a bar in San Francisco, 547 Haight Street. But Gary kind of cringes. He doesn't want us to sell our brand out, but we pay homage to a lot of other companies that inspired us here. And the reason I bring it up is because that's a low alcohol 547. We want to have 2 or 3 and drive home, and that's not allowable with a 547.
Yeah.
It's
And
not-
just to give a shout out to who asked the original question was Tim Summers, who's
Yep.
a listener
Yep.
to the
Tim's
show.
great.
Yeah, and I think he's planning his own. I think I've convinced him to do a distillery. So he and I are kind of on the side talking a lot about this stuff.
One of the things I always heard is like Robert Downey Jr. He does Iron Man because it gives him the money and the opportunity to then do indie films.
Yeah, that's a good
And
one.
how much of this is like, okay, we're going to do the hard cider or citrus or whatever, or the seltzer,
Citrus.
The dinosaur name
Dinosaurs.
seltzer.
which I've seen, people come and order because those are popular right now.
we do 20% of our sales in seltzer. It's crazy. Yeah,
Really?
it on a weekend. Now, when you get your weekday
Yeah, we can
crowd, that's
we
not the
can
same.
tell by the data if
Yeah.
it's like who's there.
If it's a weekend crowd, they're going to
Yeah.
crush those seltzers.
and
yeah.
but they're not your Monday through Friday crowd.
No, those crowds like our IPAs and our English ales and our lagers. Yeah.
Cask sales go
Because
down on Saturday.
I can always tell if I'm sitting at the bar, so I hear someone order what they order.
Yeah.
If someone's getting a tall mast
Yeah.
or something, or even
Yeah.
a triple debauchery or
Yeah.
something like that, I can always tell kind of how sophisticated a beer drinker they are.
Or how acquainted they are with us.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's wrap up this episode. We still have a lot more to talk about. I want to thank everyone for listening to another episode of Respecting the Beer. And make sure to subscribe to the show and check out the Facebook group and Patreon page to receive updates about future episodes.